This is going to be the first one that is about the origins of the Cold War, and for the most part, this is all going to be review of stuff that you learned last year, so it should go by pretty quick. So, first things first, if you want to actually pause this video and then go onto our class website, we have a video from Billy Joel's We Didn't Start the Fire. It's a great song that condenses all of the social and political major events year by year within about 5 minutes. So it's a great song to use as kind of a way to put a lot of this information into chronological order, since we are going to be jumping around quite a bit and doing things a little bit more thematically. So if you want to stop this and go for it, I'll be back with you in just a minute. So I hope you enjoyed that song as much as I typically do. So let's get some overview of the Cold War and things that you'll need to remember throughout this key period. First thing is that the Cold War is an economic, political, technological, scientific, and military confrontation, as well as a competition between us and the Soviet Union. We are going to find a lot of different ways to fight them without ever actually fighting the Soviet Union directly. This is going to take place between 1945 and 1991, and it is considered to begin as a result of the Yalta Conference. At the Yalta Conference, if you recall from our last key period, they determined that the Allies would occupy each of them a different section of Germany. The idea was that they would help rebuild those sections, then bring Germany back together again and reunify once Germany was no longer a threat. Then the people of Germany would get a chance to vote on which type of government they wanted. However, the Soviet Union demanded that they get a larger portion of Germany because they're the only ones that are communist and the other 3 allied nations were democratic, and they felt that that wasn't fair. So somehow we agreed to that, and East Germany would be dominated by the Soviet Union, and the Soviet Union would dominate them politically as well as economically, as well as demand heavy reparations from the people of East Germany as punishment for starting World War II. This is also going to take place during a very long period of time. This is going to occur during the presidency all the way from Truman all the way to Bush Sr., or Papa Bush, as I sometimes refer to him. So this is an extremely long period of time. People, lived the vast majority of their lives with the Cold War in operation. So let's do a quick review of the things that you guys learned last year in the Cold War. So first things first, the 2 countries that are involved, the United States on the left-hand side being represented by Harry Truman, the first president who is going to be involved in the Cold War. And on the right-hand side, we have Joseph Stalin, the leader of the Soviet Union, who is the other country involved in this. Now, we also need to know a bit about the 2 philosophies and ideologies that are going to be in conflict here. On the United States side, we support economically the idea of capitalism. We believe in free enterprise, that private companies have the ability to compete for better prices, compete for customers by creating better products or better prices. We also generally believe in laissez-faire, that the government should keep its hands off of business unless required for the benefit of workers or the consumer, as well as we believe in a free market, that companies should be allowed to buy and sell as the market demands, that it should not be controlled by the government. So laissez-faire and free market kind of go together. Politically, we believe in a democracy, and in a democracy, the ultimate power rests with the people. The word democracy literally means the people rule, demos and kratos. Now, on the flip side, the Soviets believe in communism, and this is kind of both a political and an economic philosophy, but under communism, there is no private ownership. Everything is owned by the government, and the government plans production. That means the government determines how much is going to be produced, how much it's going to be allowed to be sold for, who's going to produce it, etc., etc. They are also centrally planned. That means that the government controls all aspects of life, that the government tells you what kind of language that you can speak, what type of art is okay to produce, even if religion is allowed at all. This is decided to create a society that not only does not quote-unquote have conflict, but also it is to create a classless society. That is the ultimate goal of communism. So we're going to go back a little bit and we're going to look at what happens as a result of the Yalta Conference. So what will happen is that the Allies, since three of us have the exact same type of government, we're going to combine our occupation zones. And so the three of these, the Great Britain, French, and American zones, will all begin to be combined. And so that'll create the divide between us and the communist side, which will be occupied by the Soviet Union. And so this is going to be known as East Germany, and the rest is going to be known as West Germany. We also see the exact same thing happening here in Berlin, where Berlin is also going to be divided between the four allies, three of which are going to unify together to make West Berlin, and then the Soviets will create East Berlin. However, the Soviet Union doesn't just stick with Germany by itself. In fact, the Soviets began to occupy the lands that they had liberated during World War II. Countries that they had liberated from the Germans, like Poland and Austria and Czechoslovakia, would all be occupied by the Soviets. And then when the war is over, the Soviets would start to rebuild, but also, for the most part, maintain control of those countries. And they became known as satellite nations, countries that were indirectly ruled by the Soviet Union. Essentially, the leaders of these countries were puppet governments set up by the communists in the Soviet Union. And this is really quite fearful for the Americans, because we start to see the spreading of Soviet influence moving further and further westward. And we start to see that there is like this divide across Europe. And so that is going to lead to one of the most famous speeches to come from this time. And it's going to come from Winston Churchill. He had just finished his role as prime minister, and he was actually here in the United States giving a college commencement speech. And he said the following: "From Stettin in the Baltic to Trieste in the Adriatic, an iron curtain has descended across the continent. Behind that line lie all the capitals of the ancient states of Central and Eastern Europe: Warsaw, Berlin, Prague, Vienna, Budapest, Belgrade, Bucharest, and Sofia. All these famous cities and the populations around them lie in what I must call the Soviet sphere, and all are subject, in one form or another, not only to Soviet influence, but to a very high and in some cases increasing measure of control from Moscow." And this image right here does a great job of illustrating that iron curtain, that it's this seeming divide between the East and West. And what you will also notice is that not only does it seem to just cut off the West from the East, but what is happening here in the East is incredibly it seems industrious, but at the same time, it also does not seem like things are being rebuilt in a way that's beneficial to the people that live there, but more beneficial to the people of Moscow. And that's exactly what was happening. So when we take Winston Churchill's ideas to the literal sense, we see that communism will begin to spread throughout the world, and that is of great concern to the United States and the rest of the democratic nations. This map here shows you the various nations that are involved or supportive of democracy or communism. So the ones that are of any kind of blue, that is, those are going to be countries that are supportive of democratic ideals. Those that are in red are supportive of communist ideals. Now, although this map right here seems to illustrate that the entire world was split between these two ideologies, communism does not survive in the long run. In fact, today there are only 5 remaining communist nations, and those are as follows. We have, we have China, we have Vietnam, we have Cuba, North Korea, and Laos. These countries are the only remaining communist nations in the world, and in reality, most of them are not even truly communist anymore. A good example of this is China. China is not really communist anymore because they have realized that communism actually limits their productivity. When you tell people how much they can make of something or what they can make, or that everybody is essentially going to make the same amount of money regardless of their education or regardless of their abilities, in this attempt to create a classless society. The problem with that is there's no motivation to do anything new, to invent, to innovate. And so because of that, your entire economy begins to stall and plateau. And that is why countries like China have gone to a somewhat more mixed economy, very heavily communist, but with some capitalist elements. But that won't happen for many years. So let's see how we initially try and curb this spread of communism. When we're trying to figure out how to curb communism, who's the best person to ask but an American living in Russia? And so we ask George Kennan, who is the United States ambassador living in Moscow. And we ask him what should be done about this Soviet spread. And he sends a message, an 8,000 plus word telegram that outlined the Soviet situation. And it became known as the long telegram. So what did he say in here? Well, number one, he says if the United States can prevent Soviet expansion, the Soviet system would eventually collapse in upon itself. Because again, as I just said, communism does not spur innovation, so they would eventually run out of money and they would not be able to survive. The second thing he pointed out is that the Soviets are resistant to logic, but they do respond to force. And so he said, if we can use any kind of force against them, that is going to be the best method to prevent their spread and to defeat them in the long run. And so this is going to result in a policy that is going to be the main focus of our foreign policy for the next about 50 years, and it's called containment. And this is a plan to keep communism from spreading by using diplomatic, economic, as well as military force. So what's going to be our first way of doing this? It's going to be something called the Truman Doctrine. President Truman sees the danger that is lurking in Greece and Turkey, that Greece and Turkey are looking at potentially turning to communism. And so the United States decides to give Greece and Turkey $400 million to stop this communist aggression. And lo and behold, because they just got a whole bunch of free money from the United States, they're like, well, we don't need to be communist. And so they turn to democracy. And we're like, oh my God, this worked really well. If we're able to do this with the rest of Europe, maybe we can stop this march of communism from going across Europe. And so we institute the Marshall Plan, which does very much the same thing to prevent the spread of communism into the economically devastated regions of Europe. And so we tell all the countries in Europe, hey, as long as you promise not to become communist, we will give you just a ton of free money. And we spent millions upon millions upon millions of dollars. And the result of this is that those nations that turned away from communism were able to recover economically and be able to recover relatively quickly. The Soviets, however, they refused to allow U.S. aid to go to countries in Eastern Europe. And so because of this, recovery was extremely slow in the Eastern Bloc. Pretty much all repairs would come to a halt in the eastern part of Europe by the mid-1960s. And most of that was slow and not very good. And not very modern. Whereas you look at just the other side, for example, in Berlin, you look at the other side of the street in Western Berlin, supported by democracy and supported by capitalism, and things have been rebuilt extremely quickly and very, very modernly. Stalin also makes the same mistake that pretty much all communist leaders do. He sets forth a series of 5-year plans. And these 5-year plans were created to improve the economy, to improve the amount of industrialization, and improve the amount of heavy industry. And what ends up happening is that these quotas are so incredibly high that nobody can really keep up with them. And instead of kind of like taking a step back and going, okay, well, maybe that was a little too, too big of a jump, and saying, okay, well, we'll just try to do a little bit more next year. He doesn't do that. He sets an even bigger goal and says, oh, and by the way, you got to catch up to what we didn't do the last time. He sets these impossible goals, and then the people get punished as a result of it. He reestablishes the very harsh dictatorship of the Soviet Union. He brings back the forced labor camps. He brings back the Gulag, and he begins to purge culture and art. The first ones that he attacks are the intelligentsia. He begins to attack the professors, the news. He actually takes over the news media, saying that they are enemies of the state. He closes them down and then reopens them as being state-run media. So clearly the only news that you're going to get is what has already been approved of by Stalin. That art and literature that is dangerous to the ideas of communism are no longer allowed to be produced. Even things that are some of their most important and most kind of like culturally celebrated artists and writers will not be allowed to be produced in Russia, just because the ideas are so dangerous to the overall ideas of communism. So when we look at this map here, it's pretty clear the success of the Marshall Plan, that these countries were given vast amounts of money in order to rebuild. Now, the two countries that received the most are the UK and France. Now, was there any possibility that France or the UK was going to become communist? Clearly no. So why did we give them so much? It was largely so that they could rebuild and then take on this kind of leadership role alongside us. We knew that without the UK and without France having a strong economy, we were going to have to be spending all the money on all of the rebuilding, having to spend all of the money on defeating the Soviets, and we knew that we couldn't do that on our own. So this was really kind of for our benefit just as much as it was for theirs. Now, imagine that you're Stalin, right? And you have the city of Berlin, where half of the city is communist, like the rest of East Germany, but the other half is democratic, and things are rebuilding really fast there, and things seem to be really good, and you're starting to see people defect from your side of the city over to the western side. He doesn't want this to happen. This doesn't like this little oasis of democracy inside East Germany. And so what he does is he closes access to Western Berlin in hopes of forcing the democratic half of the city to fall and for them to beg to join the communist side. However, when you tell Americans that we can't do something, we're going to find a way to do it. And we're going to do it really well. And so when you tell us, oh, I'm sorry, you can't go into Berlin anymore, you can't go by truck and you can't land your planes there, what are we going to do? Well, we organized something called the Berlin Airlift. And with this, we sent cargo planes over Western Berlin, and we dropped food and supplies and medicine and candy bars and children's toys and a million other little things that were meant to not only help the people of Western Berlin survive, but also to give them that morale boost that they would need as a reminder of the United States is here and we are going to back you up no matter what. We are not going to abandon you. We did this for 11 months, and the Berlin Airlift was incredibly successful. And it was so successful that by 1949, Stalin had to reopen access because his plan just didn't work. So we've set up this very clear competition between the East and West. We have this fear of the spread of communism that we're trying to stop. And so we decide that the best way to combat it is to create an alliance for our protection. And that is going to be known as the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, better known as NATO. This was created in 1949. And in this, every country that joins agrees to aid any other member nation that has been attacked. This is a way for us to kind of have a military alliance. However, all nations are treated equally within NATO. Although the United States and Great Britain will kind of take on the leadership positions, every nation that joins is considered equal. And the goal of this clearly is to curb communism and to protect democracy. On the flip side, the Soviets see, us putting together this kind of military alliance, and they don't want to be left behind. They definitely don't want to be left unprotected, and so they put together the Warsaw Pact, which is a mutual defense treaty of 8 communist states. However, unlike NATO, they are completely under Soviet control, that the Soviets are the dominating factor. They have also both political and military control over these nations. So not only was it just like political influence by the Soviets on these satellite nations, now your military can be confiscated essentially by the Soviets and used whatever way the Soviets see fit, really without your say-so. And so these would be the groups that would face off during the period of the Cold War. So there's one major issue, though, that is facing the United States and the Soviet Union in this competition, and that is weaponry. Now, in 1945, when the United States dropped the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, we had a monopoly on nuclear technology. However, within 5 years, the Soviet Union will have tested their first atomic bomb, known as Joe 1, and it will be almost identical to Fat Man. And it's kind of shocking, like, well, gee, how on earth would they not only be able to get this technology so quickly, because it took us a whole lot longer than 5 years, but also how would they end up making one that's almost identical to the United States one? Clearly there's some shady business going on. So because we are trying to make sure that we are protected and that we are able to defend ourselves against any kind of Soviet attack, this is going to be the beginning of what is known as the nuclear arms race, which is this competition for supremacy in nuclear warfare that is between us and the Soviet Union. Now, there's going to be a few other things that come in kind of in conjunction with this, and one of these is the foreign policy of brinkmanship. Brinkmanship is going to be really popular with President Eisenhower and Truman. Brinkmanship says that we are willing to go to the brink of nuclear war in order to keep peace. Now that seems a little odd, like we're going to threaten to like destroy the world in order to keep peace. But when you think about it, most countries are not willing to be the guy who presses the button. Nobody wants to go down in history as the nation that started World War III. And this is partially because of a policy called massive retaliation. Essentially, if one side attacks, then the other side will have to attack with equal or greater firepower. And this is eventually, or like supposed to, prevent one side from wanting to attack at all, that they will be more cautious knowing that there could be massive retaliation. What this also does, though, is that it does create cuts in traditional military, that more of our country's finances are going to go towards atomic weaponry. We're also going to have, going along with this idea, is mutually assured destruction, and this is really what makes brinkmanship work. If one side pushes the button and one side is willing to drop the bomb, the other side will do the same, and both sides will end up being destroyed. And so, theoretically, it is going to restrain each nation from attacking the other in order to prevent their own people from being destroyed. Now, how this is going to be made possible is with a group called the Military-Industrial Complex. This is an informal alliance between our nation's military and private arms groups. So for those of you who, I guess, need a pop culture reference, if you've seen the original Iron Man, this is what Tony Stark did for the U.S. government. He built weapons for the U.S. government. He's a private company building them for the public, which is the federal government. And the reason that this is supposed to work is because both sides benefit. The federal government obtains weapons and the private company gets paid to supply them. And this is also beneficial because generally private companies have more freedom as well as money to create bigger and badder weapons. And so they are going to not be tied down by like Congress and things like that in order to make the newest, best weapon that's going to help protect the United States. However, despite the fact that this is going to be very much influenced and very much used by President Dwight D. Eisenhower, he is going to warn against its power in his 1961 farewell address, where he says that the military-industrial complex, if gone unchecked, may end up not only costing the United States immense amounts of money, but also would come at the cost of the American people, which we will definitely see an amount of that happen in the future. So we're going to quickly look at how some of the technology from that military-industrial complex is going to make this arms race possible. The first of these is the B-52 bomber, which allowed for us to deliver nuclear warheads relatively easily. They could fly across continents very quickly, much quicker than previous planes had, and they could have a lot longer time up in the air, which allowed them to go across continents if needed. We also developed the nuclear submarine, which allowed a level of stealth in the delivering of nuclear weapons that we did not have before. Also, by the end of the 1950s, we are going to develop the ICBM, the Intercontinental Ballistic Missile. This would essentially allow for us to shoot a rocket that will deliver nuclear bombs to anywhere in the world, not only extremely quickly, but also without any threat to the lives of our own people. This could literally go from New York to Moscow in about 30 minutes. So very effective and protective of American lives. And finally, the kind of first major development or improvement in nuclear weaponry itself, not just the delivery method, is the hydrogen bomb, or the H-bomb. The very first H-bomb was known as Ivy Mike, and it was detonated in 1952 in the Bikini Islands. And it was so incredibly massive, had a mushroom cloud over 100 miles wide and 25 miles high, killing all life that was in the surrounding Bikini Islands. And it was so earth-shattering, it was so world-changing, that about a year later, a man that was a fashion designer had created a very, very tiny two-piece bathing suit that itself was also earth-shattering and world-changing, and because of that became known as the Bikini, because it was as earth-shattering as the H-bomb that had been detonated in the Bikini Islands. Now, if you are interested in like how big these have gotten today, there are a couple of websites that are put up on our class website just next to this lecture, and they'll help you see not only just how big these weapons are, both ours and also the Soviet Union's, but then there's a second website that's called Nuke Map that will allow you to kind of test these on various places around the world. So you could see what would happen if, for example, a Soviet nuclear bomb had been actually hitting in Los Angeles or New York or Washington, D.C., and see just how big the impact would have been. So that's it for today. I hope that this helped you kind of dust off some of the cobwebs from last year, and I will see you guys in our next video lecture.